A millionaire divorces his wife, and 10 years later he meets her at the airport with a young man who looks a lot like him. He tries to approach them. The airport in Chicago was bustling that Friday morning. Ambrose Fairbanks, a successful 45-year-old businessman, hurried to his boarding gate. He was wearing an expensive suit, holding a leather briefcase, constantly glancing at his gold watch. Another business trip, he thought with a sigh. Despite his success, Ambrose still felt an emptiness that all the money in the world could not fill. Suddenly, something caught his attention. A woman with brown hair walked past him, holding a boy of about 10 years old. Ambrose stopped, his mouth agape. The woman's face was all too familiar. "Celine," he exclaimed in surprise. But it wasn't just Celine's appearance that surprised him. The boy beside her was like a past version of himself. The same blue eyes, the same messy blonde hair. Even the way he walked was like Ambrose when he was a child. A memory came rushing back like a punch to Ambrose's gut. He saw himself 10 years ago, sneaking out of the apartment he and Celine had shared, leaving only a cold letter on the kitchen table. Celine's face was still sleeping, oblivious to the fact that her life was about to fall apart. Ambrose felt his legs go weak. Could it be, he thought in disbelief? Celine's pregnant guilt overwhelmed him. Had he abandoned not only his wife, but also a child he never knew about? A son? Ambrose started walking towards Celine and the boy, his heart pounding. He needed to talk to them, explain, understand what was happening. But the crowd in the airport was already squeezing between them. Ambrose desperately tried to push through the crowd to get to Celine and the boy. "Celine," he shouted. But his voice was lost in the din of the airport. When he finally made it through the crowd, Celine and the boy were gone. Ambrose looked around frantically but saw no trace of them. "Sir, are you okay?" a flight attendant asked, seeing his distraught state. Ambrose barely heard her. His phone rang. It was Mavis, his current wife. He ignored the call, continuing to search for Celine and the boy. "Sir, your flight is about to depart," the flight attendant reminded. Ambrose looked at her, then back at the gate, and continued on his way to the airport lobby. In that moment, he made a decision that would change his life forever. I'm not getting on the plane," he said, his mind still reeling. The flight attendant looked at him in surprise, but Ambrose walked on, determined. He couldn't leave now. He needed to find out the truth. Leaving the airport, Ambrose hailed a taxi. Downtown, he told the driver, his mind racing. As the taxi rolled into Chicago traffic, Ambrose pulled out his phone, ignoring the missed calls from Mavis. He called an old friend, a private investigator. "Frank, it's Ambrose. I need your help finding someone," he said as soon as his friend picked up. As he told Frank what he remembered of Celine, Ambrose kept thinking about the boy, his son. Did he have a son? Guilt, curiosity, and an unnameable fear mingled inside him. Ambrose knew that his life was about to change profoundly. And for the first time in a long time, money and success didn't seem to matter anymore. What mattered now was finding Celine and the boy, and somehow making up for the terrible mistake he'd made 10 years ago. As the cab glided through the streets of Chicago, Ambrose lost himself in memories of the past. His mind drifted back to a night 10 years ago, at a bar in New York. Ambrose had been there on business, trying to close a big deal. After a frustrating day at work, he'd ordered a drink at the bar. That's when she appeared, Mavis, beautiful and confident, with a smile. Adventure promised. "Hard day?" she asked as she sat down next to him. That conversation changed everything. Mavis was an executive at a large company, full of connections and ambition. She talked about money and power in a way that made Ambrose feel small but hungry for more. Over the next months, Ambrose made excuses for more business trips. Each time he saw Mavis, he became more addicted to her presence and the promise of a life of luxury and success. "You deserve more," Mavis would say. "With the right people, you could be a millionaire." Ambrose began to compare his simple life with Celine to the glamorous existence Mavis provided. Celine, a devoted teacher and loving wife, seemed unable to understand his ambition. "Why do you need more?" Celine would ask. "Aren't we happy like this?" But Ambrose wanted more, so much more. His conflict grew every day. He loved Celine, but his desire for money and status consumed him. Mavis represented everything he thought he wanted: success, power, recognition. One cold autumn night, Ambrose made a decision that would change the lives of many people forever. He waited until Celine fell asleep, packed his things, and wrote a short, cold letter. "Celine, I can't go on like this. I need more from life than you can give me. Please don't look for me." Ambrose, with a heavy heart but blinded by ambition, Ambrose left the apartment without looking back. The tears he refused to shed burned in his eyes as he drove to the airport, toward a new life with Mavis. What Ambrose didn't know was that just days later, Celine would discover she was pregnant. Alone and desperate, she cried for hours, clutching the pregnancy test, unsure how to face a future without Ambrose. Back in the present, in a Chicago taxi, Ambrose felt the crushing weight of his past actions. How could he have been so selfish and blind? "We're here, sir," the cab driver's voice snapped him back to reality. Ambrose found himself standing in front of his detective friend Frank's office. With shaking hands, he paid the taxi and stepped out. "I need to find them," Ambrose muttered, determined. Inside Frank's office, Ambrose recounted the whole story of the airport encounter, the suspicions, and the desperate need to know the truth. "Do you understand what you're doing?" Ambrose, Frank asked, worried. "This could change everything in your life." "I know," Ambrose replied, running a hand through his hair. "But I need to know. I need to make this right." Frank sighed, but began to take notes. "I'm going to need more details on Celine's last known address, job, anything that might give us a clue." Ambrose closed his eyes, trying to remember. Each memory of Celine felt like a stab of regret. "She was a teacher," he began. "She worked at an elementary school in the north of the city. Our apartment." As Ambrose fed the information, his phone rang Mavis more and more insistently. He continued to ignore her. "This will take some time," Frank warned. "I need a few days to gather specific information." Ambrose nodded, anxious and impatient. "Do whatever it takes." Money is no object. Leaving Frank's office, Ambrose found himself lost in the heart of Chicago. The city he had once called home was now alien and hostile. He had money, success, everything he had ever wanted. But at this moment, he would give it all to go back and make the right choice. With the burden of the past on his shoulders and an uncertain future ahead, Ambrose set out to right the biggest wrong of his life. Finding Celine and the child became his sole mission. He only hoped it wasn't too late. For the next few days, Ambrose stayed in a Chicago hotel, anxiously waiting for news from Frank. He could barely sleep, tormented by thoughts of Celine and the boy who might be his son. "Is he your son?" Meanwhile, across town, Celine woke up early as usual. The small house she called home was quiet, except for the sound of cartoons playing from the living room. "Taylor, breakfast," Celine called, placing a plate of pancakes on the table. A 10-year-old boy with messy blonde hair ran into the kitchen, shouting, "Pancakes." Celine smiled, ruffling her son's hair some more. Her smile faded for a moment, as she realized once again how much Thayer resembled Ambrose. As Thayer ate, Celine lost herself in memories. The first years after Ambrose left had been a nightmare. Pregnant and alone, she struggled to hold down her teaching job as her belly grew. A flashback came to her mind. Celine, 8 months pregnant, sitting on the bathroom floor, crying with unpaid bills scattered around her. Fear of the future overwhelmed her. Back in the present, Celine shook her head, trying to push away the painful memories. "We did it, didn't we, honey?" she whispered to Thayer, but he was too busy with his pancakes to notice. The doorbell rang. It was Ward, Celine's boyfriend of 2 years, a kind man with a welcoming smile and soft eyes. "Good morning, my dears," Ward said as he walked in, kissing Celine and hugging Thayer. Celine felt a wave of gratitude. Ward had truly been a gift in their lives, accepting Thayer as his own. Across town, Ambrose received his first word from Frank. "She still lives in the same neighborhood," Frank said over the phone. "In a little house on Maple Street." Ambrose's heart pounded. "Else. So close after all this time." "What about the baby?" he asked anxiously. "Yes," Frank replied. "She has a son named Thayer who is 10 years old and attends the local school. From what I can gather, Celine has raised him alone since birth." The words hit Ambrose like a punch. Yes, he had a son he had never met, who had grown up without a father. "There's one more thing," Frank continued. "Celine has been dating a man named Ward for 2 years. From what I understand, he's been very involved and present in their lives." Ambrose felt a sudden pang of jealousy that shook him. What right did he have to feel jealous? Meanwhile, at the mansion in the wealthy suburbs of Chicago, Mavis paced back and forth, furious. Ambrose hadn't returned her calls in days. First, he'd missed an important flight. Now he was completely absent. "Something's wrong," she muttered, running through a series of possibilities. Back at Celine's house, the morning continued as usual. Ward helped Thayer pack his bags while Celine prepared his lunch. "Don't forget we're having dinner with your parents tonight," Ward reminded gently. Celine nodded, smiling, but there was an uneasy feeling in her stomach ever since she'd seen the man at the airport, who looked so much like Ambrose. She'd been unable to shake the feeling that something was about to change. Ambrose, now driving slowly down Maple Street, felt the same. His heart stopped when he saw the modest house Frank had described a swing in the front yard, and a bicycle propped on the porch. He parked across the street, watching silently. What would he say? How would he explain his actions? How would he apologize for 10 years of absence? Just then the front door opened. Celine stepped out, still as beautiful as ever, followed by Thayer and a man Ambrose assumed was Ward. They laughed like a happy family, getting ready for school. Ambrose sank into the car seat, caught in a storm of emotions: guilt, regret, jealousy, fear, but also a growing resolve. Somehow he needed to be a part of that life. He needed to see his son, He needed to mend what had been broken long ago. But how could he do that without destroying the happiness Celine and Thayer seemed to have found? In the days that followed, Ambrose could not leave Maple Street. He parked a few doors down, silently watching Celine's family go about their daily lives. Every time he saw Thayer, he yearned more and more to see his son. Heart clenched. One sunny afternoon, Ambrose mustered up the courage to get out of his car. He walked down the opposite sidewalk, trying to act casual as Celine stepped outside to water her plants. Their eyes met. The watering can fell from Celine's hand, water spilling onto the ground. "Ambrose," she whispered, in disbelief. Before he could answer, Celine was across the street, her eyes blazing with anger. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice shaking. Ambrose stammered, "Celine, I saw you at the airport with Thayer." "Don't you dare mention his name," Celine interrupted. "You have no right to." Nosy neighbors began to peek through their windows, drawn by the noise. "Celine, please," Ambrose begged. "I know I was wrong, but Thayer, he's my son, isn't he?" Celine closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. When she opened them, they were full of unshed tears. "Yes," she said finally. "Thayer is your real son, the one you abandoned before you knew he existed." The words slapped Ambrose in the face. "I didn't know," he muttered. "If I did so," what Celine interrupted, "you would stay." "Don't lie to yourself, Ambrose. You made your decision 10 years ago." Ambrose stepped forward. "Let me see him, please." "I know I don't deserve it." "But no," Celine almost shouted. "Yes, you don't. Thayer has a good life, a family who loves him. I won't let you ruin that." Just then a car pulled up. Ward stepped out, looking from the agitated Celine to the well-dressed stranger. "What's wrong?" honey, Ward asked, placing a protective arm around Celine. Ambrose felt a wave of irrational jealousy. This man was living the life that should have been his. "Nothing," Celine replied, not taking her eyes off Ambrose. "He's leaving." Ward looked from one to the other, sensing the tension. "You two know each other?" Before Celine could reply, a school bus stopped around the corner. Thayer got out, walking toward them. Celine panicked. "Ambrose, go." Without thinking, Ambrose hid behind a tree. His heart pounded as he watched Thayer approach. The boy was a reflection of himself as a child. "Mom, is everything okay?" Thayer asked, seeing his mother's tension. Celine forced a smile. "It's okay, honey. Let's go inside, okay? Ward will help you with your homework." Thayer entered the house, followed by Ward, who kept glancing at Ambrose, who was hiding in confusion. Celine stopped. "Go away, Ambrose," she whispered. "Don't come back, please." Ambrose stepped out from behind the tree, heartbroken. "Celine, you know," she interrupted. "You don't know what I've been through, what Thayer has been through. I won't let you ruin it with that." Celine entered the house, closing the door firmly behind her. Ambrose stood on the sidewalk, feeling more lost than ever. He had seen his son so close yet so out of reach. Inside the house, Celine leaned against the door, trembling. Ward appeared in the hallway, worried. Celine, who was that? She looked at Ward, who had been her safe haven all these years. She owed him the truth. "That's Ambrose, Thayer's father," she began, her voice trembling. Ward paled. "What? But why?" Celine took a deep breath. "It's a long story, one I hope I never have to tell." Meanwhile, Ambrose returned to the car, broken but determined. He had made the worst mistake of his life 10 years ago. Now he needed to find a way to make it right, no matter how impossible it seemed. That night, Ambrose lay awake in the hotel, tormented by painful memories. For the first time, he faced his past behavior with brutal clarity. Flashbacks flooded his mind. Ambrose and Celine 5 years before he left, Celine eagerly sharing about the promotion at school. "That was great, baby," Ambrose said nonchalantly, not taking his eyes off. "He's alive?" the boy asked, a mixture of shock and confusion. Celine nodded, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "Yes, he's alive, and he wants to see you." Thayer was silent, trying to take in what his mother had just said. Celine continued, recounting the details of how Ambrose had left, and then how she'd found out she was pregnant. Each word she uttered confused the boy more. "Why did he leave us?" Thayer asked, his voice soft, his eyes full of hurt. Celine took a deep breath. "It's complicated, honey, but the important thing is that it wasn't your fault. He made a big mistake." Thayer bowed his head, his heart a jumble of emotions. He'd been wondering about the father he'd never seen for years. The uneasy, vague sense of why his father had left was more evident now than ever. Meanwhile, Ambrose stood outside, feeling as if everything was slipping away from him. After a brief conversation with Thayer before he left for school, he was filled with joy at talking to his son for the first time. But at the same time, sadness and guilt invaded. Did he really deserve to be in his son's life after everything that had happened? In the lavish mansion, Mavis had discovered the shocking truth. "Son," she hissed through gritted teeth, her eyes shining dangerously. That idiot has a son and never told me she paced the luxurious room, her thoughts racing. That explains Ambrose's strange behavior, his sudden disappearance. A cruel smile appeared on Mavis's lips. So this is how you want to play, Ambrose? To trade your life of luxury for a schoolteacher and a child? She picked up the phone, her fingers quickly dialing. Hello, Mr. Johnson. I need you to look into the Thayer boy, right? I want to know everything. And prepare the divorce papers. Looks like I'll need them soon. She hung up, already formulating a plan in her mind. If Ambrose thought he could just leave her in his life of luxury, he was in for a big surprise. Mavis never gave up without a fight, and she always fought to win. Meanwhile, Celine spent a restless night, struggling with her thoughts. The next morning, with deep dark circles under her eyes, she made her decision. Thayer needed to know the truth. The next morning after breakfast, Celine called Thayer over. They sat on the sofa, Celine taking a deep breath, starting the conversation she had been dreading. Remember when you asked about your dad? Thayer nodded, curious. What's wrong? Mom. Celine felt her voice shake. My dad, he's in town. He wants to see me. Thayer went from surprise to confusion, then finally anger. He abandoned us, Thayer shouted, standing up. And now he wants to see me. No. I don't want to see him. Thayer, please understand. Celine tried to soothe the boy. Understand what? That your real father is a coward. Thayer ran straight into the room, slamming the door. Celine collapsed onto the sofa, tears streaming down her face. She knew this would be difficult, but the pain in Thayer's eyes broke her. Meanwhile, Ambrose finally confronted Mavis at her mansion. What are you doing here? Mavis asked coldly. I thought you were too busy with your little secret family. Ambrose was shocked. How did you know? Oh, dear. Mavis laughed coldly. I've always known. The question is, what are you going to do now? I came here to say it's over, Mavis. I can't live this lie any longer. Mavis's face twisted in anger. You think you can leave me after all I've done for you? What you did was manipulate me, Ambrose replied. You stoked my ambition, made me abandon Celine, and you were ready for it. Mavis interrupted sarcastically. Don't play the victim, Ambrose. You chose money and power. I just showed you the way. Ambrose felt shame burn inside him. She was right, he had made his own choice. But now I'm choosing another path, he said, turning away. If you walk out that door, Mavis threatened, I'll expose every dirty deal you've made, every bribe, every illegal deal. You'll lose everything. Ambrose paused. He knew Mavis wasn't joking. At Celine's house, Ward came home from work to find her still shaking on the sofa. What happened? He asked worriedly. Celine recounted her conversation with Thayer. Ward held her, but Celine could sense his tension. Do you think I did the right thing? Celine asked. Uncertain, Ward hesitated. I think so. But what about now? Will Ambrose be a part of our lives? Celine heard the fear in Ward's voice. He's Thayer's father, Ward. But you've always been here. Ward nodded, but the air between them was filled with uncertainty. That night, Ambrose wandered the streets, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. Mavis's threats echoed in his ears, mingling with memories of his past selfish behavior. The flashbacks came back like punches. Ambrose dismissing Celine's dream of pursuing a master's degree, Ambrose ignoring Celine's emotional needs in his focus on making money. The realization hit him like a punch. Sexism and greed had not only destroyed his marriage, but had stolen precious years with his son. Standing outside Celine's house, Ambrose saw Thayer's light go out, his son close but far away. I'm sorry, Ambrose whispered into the darkness. I'm sorry for everything. He knew he had a long way to go confronting Mavis, righting past wrongs, regaining Thayer and Celine's trust. But for the first time in years, Ambrose was determined to do the right thing, no matter the cost. With one last look at the house, Ambrose turned and walked into the darkness, ready to face the consequences of his actions and fight for a chance to be a part of his son's life. Ambrose continued to wander the streets of Chicago, his mind in turmoil. Though the guilt gnawed at him, the desire to connect with Thayer kept him going. He felt like a ship in a storm, rudderless and with nowhere to go. One afternoon, Ambrose saw Thayer leaving school. Without thinking, he approached. Hey, Thayer, remember me? The one with the soccer ball? Ambrose smiled nervously. Thayer looked at him suspiciously. Yes. What do you want? I just wanted to see how you were doing, Ambrose said awkwardly, realizing too late that he had sounded a little odd. I'm fine, Thayer replied, leaving quickly. Ambrose stood there feeling foolish. Later, back at the hotel, he burst into tears for the first time in years. When he saw Celine and Ambrose standing on the porch, Thayer was crying. What's going on? Ward asked, his eyes darkening at the sight of Ambrose there. Celine tried to keep her composure. Ward, he's Thayer's father. Ward sighed, feeling like everything was falling apart. Why is he here now? We're having a good life, and he shows up. Ambrose, feeling the tension rising, stepped forward. Ward, I understand my presence makes things difficult, but I am here to fix my mistakes, not ruin your lives. Thayer, tears still streaming down his face, turned to his mother with anger and confusion. "Why did you hide this from me? Why didn't you tell me before?" Celine sat down beside Thayer, her eyes filled with guilt. "I just wanted to protect you. I was afraid that knowing the truth would hurt you, but you deserve to know," Thayer said, his voice still shaking. "He abandoned us, and now he's come back like nothing ever happened." Ambrose nodded, looking straight at his son. "You're right, Thayer. I abandoned you and your mother, and that was the biggest mistake of my life. I can't change the past, but I want to make it right. If you'll let me." Thayer didn't respond immediately, but the hurt in his eyes was still evident. Meanwhile, in his office, Ambrose made one of the hardest decisions of his life. He picked up the phone, his hands shaking. "Mr. Johnson, this is Ambrose Fairbanks. I need to confess to some unethical business practices I've committed over the years." Ambrose knew this decision would mean losing his fortune, even going to jail, but he couldn't live with the weight of his secrets any longer. He needed to face the consequences of what he had done, no matter how hard it was. At Celine's house, Ward stood there, listening to the conversation between Celine, Thayer, and Ambrose, feeling conflicted. Part of him wanted to protect Celine and Thayer from the turmoil Ambrose was bringing, but another part understood that Thayer had a right to know the truth about his father. Ambrose stood there, guilt and heaviness weighing down on him, but also a new feeling, determination. No matter how hard it was, he would face everything, including his past mistakes, for a chance to be close to his son and make amends. Thayer, after a moment of silence, looked straight into his father's eyes. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Dad, but I want to know the truth." Ambrose nodded, feeling as if a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "You will know everything, Thayer. I will not hide anything from you." Their lives would never be the same again, but now they were ready to face the future, no matter how uncertain and difficult it was. His voice was strained, and Celine was exhausted both mentally and physically, pulling Ward aside. "Ward, I can't marry you." The words were out before she could think. Ward stepped back as if she had been slapped. "Is it because of him?" Ward asked, pointing at Ambrose. "No," Celine answered honestly. "It's because of me, because of Thayer. We need to work through our past. I can't drag you into this mess." Ward left, hurt and confused, leaving Celine heartbroken but strangely relieved. The next morning, Ambrose's world came crashing down. The headlines screamed business tycoon admits fraud. Mavis, furious at Ambrose's confession, leaked every detail she could find to the press. Reporters surrounded Celine's house, shouting questions about Ambrose and Thayer. Celine panicked, trying to shield Thayer from the chaos. "Mom, why are they here?" Thayer asked worriedly. "It's complicated, honey," Celine replied, pulling the curtain shut, "but it'll pass." Ambrose, trapped in his hotel, watched his life fall apart. His assets were frozen, his business partners abandoned him, and the possibility of jail became very real. Desperate, he called Celine. "I'm sorry," he said as soon as she picked up. "I didn't mean to upset you." Celine sighed. "I know, Ambrose, but it happened." "What are we going to do?" Ambrose closed his eyes, guilt taking over. "I'm going to fix this." Celine, somehow that night as camera flashes lit up the street, Celine sat with Thayer in his room. "Thayer, I know this is hard," she began, "but your father, he's trying to do the right thing." Thayer was silent for a moment. "He's going to jail, isn't he?" Celine's heart clenched. "I don't know, honey, but no matter what happens, we'll always be together, okay?" Meanwhile, Ambrose faced the possibility of losing everything, but for the first time in years he felt at peace. The truth was costly, but it was a price he was willing to pay for the chance to be a father to his son. Sitting alone in his hotel room, Ambrose picked up the phone again. It was time to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how painful. "Hello, yes, this is Ambrose Fairbanks. I am willing to surrender to the authorities." The sun had just risen when Celine entered Thayer's room to wake him. Her heart sank when she saw the empty bed and the wide-open window. A crumpled note on the table read, "I need time to think. Don't look for me." In a panic, Celine called Ambrose. "Thayer's gone," she screamed as soon as he picked up. Ambrose felt his world spinning. "I'm coming," he said, already running for the door. When Ambrose arrived, he found Celine crying on the porch. For a moment they forgot all about the past, left only with their shared concern for their son. "We'll find him," Ambrose promised, holding Celine's hand tightly. They began their search, going through every street, every park Thayer had ever been to. With each passing minute, their fears grew. "What if something happens to him?" Celine said, trembling. Ambrose swallowed. "Nothing will happen. We can't lose hope." As they searched, memories of the past flooded their minds. Celine remembered Ambrose playing with Thayer as a baby in the garden before everything fell apart. Ambrose remembered the moment he first held Thayer in the hospital, the love he felt, the fear that drove him to run away. Ward appeared late in the afternoon, panting. "I came as soon as I heard," he said. "How can I help?" Celine looked at him, surprised and grateful. Despite everything, Ward still cared. "Thank you," she whispered, gently touching his arm. The three of them split up to search further. Night fell, cold and threatening, adding to everyone's desperation. Finally, it was Ambrose who discovered a clue in the old park where he had taken Celine years ago. He saw a lone figure sitting on a swing. "Thayer," he called softly as he approached. The boy looked up, his eyes. Thayer's eyes were red from crying. "Why are you coming back now?" he asked. His voice choked. "Why now?" Ambrose sat down on the swing next to his son, his heart heavy. "Because I made the biggest mistake of my life by leaving you guys, and I've regretted it. Every regretted day since." Thayer was silent for a moment. "You heard what Mom said, I abandoned you guys?" "Yes," Ambrose replied, tears welling up in his eyes. "And there's nothing I can do to change that. But here I am, trying to make things right. Even if you never forgive me, I want you to know that I love you, Thayer. I always will." At that moment, Celine and Ward came running in. "Thayer," Celine cried, hugging her son tightly. The scene was interrupted by the appearance of Mavis, who stepped in angrily. "Is this it?" she shouted at Ambrose. "You threw away everything we built for this pitiful little family." Ambrose stood up, placing herself between Mavis and the family. "Enough, Mavis. It's over, it's over." She laughed bitterly. "You'll lose it all, Ambrose. Your fortune, your freedom, everything." "For what?" Ambrose looked at Celine and Thayer, then back at Mavis. "For the one thing money can't buy, family, true love." Mavis stepped forward, angry, but Ward intervened, holding her back. "I think you should leave," he said firmly. Outnumbered, Mavis threw one last contemptuous look and left, leaving a tense atmosphere behind. Ambrose turned to Celine, Thayer, and Ward. "I'm sorry," his voice was heavy with emotion. "For everything. For what I've done in the past, for the chaos I brought into your life. Tomorrow I'll turn myself into the authorities. You won't have to worry about me anymore." Thayer, surprising everyone, stepped forward. "Dad, are you going to jail?" Ambrose nodded sadly. "Maybe. Dad did wrong, Thayer, and he's going to pay for those mistakes." Thayer looked at his mother, then back at Ambrose. "But what if you want to know more about Dad?" Ambrose's heart swelled with hope. "Dad would be happy, more than anything, if you wanted to." "But I understand if you don't." Celine, tears streaming down her cheeks, hugged Thayer. "It's your choice, honey. We'll always be there for you, no matter what you decide." In that moment, under the stars in the old park, a broken family began to slowly mend. It wouldn't be easy, there was much to undo, much to forgive, but for the first time in years there was hope. Ambrose, Celine, and Thayer embraced, a hug filled with tears, regret, and most of all love. Ward watched from a distance, a sad smile on his face, knowing he had done the right thing. The future was still uncertain, but at least tonight they were together, and for now that was enough. The judge's gavel rang out in the courtroom, sealing Ambrose's fate. Convicted of financial fraud, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison in order to repay all the money he had embezzled. Ambrose accepted the sentence with a calmness that surprised everyone. To him, it was a fair price for his mistakes. In the following months, Ambrose spent his time in prison reflecting and planning for the future. He took courses in business ethics and began developing ideas to support small businesses upon his release. Celine, true to her promise, allowed Thayer to visit Ambrose in prison. The first visits were tense and awkward, but gradually father and son began to truly understand each other. "How was your math test?" Ambrose asked, genuinely concerned. Thayer, initially reluctant, slowly opened up. "I just took my math test and I think I did well." Ambrose smiled proudly. "I'm sure you did. You're very smart, Thayer." Over time, the conversations deepened. Thayer began asking difficult questions about the past, and Ambrose answered them honestly, no matter how painful. Celine watched the relationship develop with a mixture of concern and hope. She maintained clear boundaries, making sure Ambrose understood her role in Thayer's life. "I need you as a father," Celine told Ambrose during one visit. "But I can't risk hurting Thayer again." Ambrose nodded, respecting Celine's decision. "I understand, and I will do everything I can to be the father Thayer deserves." Meanwhile, life outside the prison continued. After much reflection and heartfelt conversation, Celine and Ward decided to give their relationship a second chance. On a warm spring day, Celine walked down the aisle, beautiful in a simple dress. Ward waited for her, his eyes shining with love. Thayer, proud, held the wedding ring. Ambrose, still in prison, received the news with mixed emotions. He was a little sad, but mostly relieved to know that Celine and Thayer had found stability and love. When Ambrose was finally released, he resolved to rebuild his life honestly. Drawing on his business knowledge, he began working with an NGO that provided free advice to small business owners. "Now I want to use my skills to do good," he explained to Thayer during one of their weekly meetings in the park. Thayer, now 12, looked at his father with new respect. "That was nice, Dad." The word dad still made Ambrose's heart leap. It was a title he was determined to live up to every day. Celine watches the growth of their new family carefully. She and Ward provide a stable, loving home for Thayer, while Ambrose tries to be a responsible present father. A year after his release from prison, Ambrose attends Thayer's science fair at school. Standing next to Celine and Ward, he feels a wave of gratitude at being a part of his son's life, albeit in a different way than he ever imagined. "I'm proud of you," Ambrose tells Thayer after his presentation. Thayer smiles, hugs Ambrose, then Celine and Ward. It's a scene that would have been unimaginable just a few months ago, a family without tradition, but united by their love for Thayer. That night, Ambrose reflects on his journey. He thinks about his egotistical past, about how he took Celine and her ambitions for granted. Now he saw his mistakes clearly. "Thank you for giving me this chance," Ambrose said to Celine when she came to pick up Thayer. Celine nodded, her eyes softening. "I'm trying, Ambrose." Thayer sees it, and so do we. As Ambrose watched Celine and Thayer leave, he felt a peace he had never experienced in his years of wealth and power. He had lost a fortune, but he had gained something far more precious, the chance to be a better father, a better man. The road ahead was long, there was much to learn, much to fix. But Ambrose was determined to move forward, one day at a time, always striving to be the best version of himself. That night, under the Chicago sky, Ambrose made a silent promise to himself, to Thayer, to Celine, and to all those he had hurt. He would live the rest of his days with integrity, compassion, and love. It was the least he could do to honor the second chance life had given him. And so, with hope in his heart and determination in his eyes, Ambrose walked towards his humble apartment, ready to face whatever tomorrow brought. His journey of redemption was far from over, but for the first time in many years he was on the right track.